Thanks for being with us today, Commissioner. Really appreciate your time. And congratulations on your award.
Oh, thank you. It's a great honor.
Can you describe what the political climate was leading up to and during and immediately following deinstitutionalization?
Sure. You got to remember that the department really came into existence in 1969. And the reason it came into existence is there were some terrible things that were going on in the institutions, which had been going on for years. But everybody would always say, well, the best way to handle that is repaint the institution or change the name from training school to reform school to something else. But this time, people said, no, let's make this a real department. And let's bring in a person who basically was a person who had never been in juvenile corrections, had a totally different outlook on how to deal with these kids. And his name was Jerry Miller. And Jerry came in, and as he walked around and started to look and see what was going on in the institutions, he said, this is terrible. He said, this is a terrible way to work with kids. And it wasn't just him. Fortunately, the stars were kind of set right, because we had Governor Sargent, who was a wonderful governor, and we had Speaker Barkley, who was the head of the House of Representatives, and we had Senator Harrington, who was wonderful, and head of the Senate. And they were all appalled. The more things came out about the institutions, they were appalled. And then you had some wonderful groups like the League of Women Voters and a lot of other reform groups that came to Massachusetts, or were here, and took this on as a major cause. So at the time, when Jerry was here, you had the top legislators were really for, we got to have some kind of a change. They don't know what they wanted, but they wanted to have some kind of a change. There was also some federal money called LEAA money, and all of that money was able to be used by the department. And so you could try some new and innovative kind of things to do this. So at a certain point, Jerry was looking, I was brought in because my background was in child welfare. And so I was very used to working with private agencies. We would place some kids in group homes, foster homes, for what is now the Department of Child and Family Services. And so I brought much more of a child welfare approach to the department. And what was bothersome for me is when I would walk through all of these institutions where these kids were supposedly the terrible juvenile delinquents, I knew the kids. They were the same ones that I used to work with when everybody used to say they're the poor orphans. Now you go in and they're all terrible juvenile delinquents. So we started setting up a variety of programs. And once that happened, Jerry looked at it one time and said, you know, the kids are doing better outside than the kids we've got inside. And his first idea was he was going to reform all of the institutions. But there was tremendous resistance against anything that was going to close those institutions. And this was obviously the people who lived in the institutions, who worked in the institution, not live, but the ones who worked there. And also all the politicians, because it was a patronage haven. Every person who was working in the institutions had a sponsor who was a legislator. I need a job. You get a job. So, and also on the court systems, it was pretty much the same. They thought this is a good system. If we don't know what to do with a kid, send them to the department. And so there were thousands of kids. If you include the county training schools, where all of these kids were going for truancy and a variety of other things, you had almost 3,000 kids in these huge institutions between the department and the counties. So when you say you're going to change something like that, it becomes very difficult. And there were an awful lot of people who wanted to make sure that it stayed just as it was. So you take a person like Jerry Miller from outside, he comes in and says, this doesn't make any sense. And we have to find a new way of working with the kids. And so Jerry did that, and it was actually on one day we closed Lyman School. We had been getting programs down, population down as far as we could. But we still had about 120 kids at Lyman School. Now, this was a different time. So you say, well, what are you going to do with those kids? You're going to close this place in one day. So what we did is we went to UMass. We got an awful lot of support from student groups. And we had the University of Massachusetts up in Amherst. Well, it was in January, so the dorms were all empty. So there was actually a caravan of cars that came down. All the students would drive down from Amherst. They went into Lyman School. We'd be saying, you take this one, you take that one, you take... And we emptied the place out in the day. And we brought them all back up to the dormitories. So they all lived in the dormitories. And then, and this would be a masterful thing that Jerry would do, some people would say you do that at night and sneak them in. What Jerry would do is he held a conference. It's actually called the Juvenile Opportunity Conference or something like that. And so we were all there. The kids were at UMass. He had the governor come out and give the keynote address at our conference. And then, naturally, we had to move the kids pretty quick because the students were coming back. So we had to find places for the 120 kids as fast as we could. But, which we did in a very short amount of time. We were able to get these kids placed in other places. But he also had the Speaker of the House come out. Everybody was taking a bow for it. And so for Jerry, he actually did close those institutions. We had drained off an awful lot of the kids, put them into other programs, but that last day, we closed it in that one period of time. So it was very, very quick. Nobody knew what was really going on. Now the problem was, all of the resources of the department were in the institutions. About 90% of the kids were out in the community. So this is where we turned to, and that was part of my major role, we turned to the private agencies. And that's where programs like Key got started. And that's where RFK got started. And that's where Old Colony Y got started. We went to Old Colony Y and said, we need some detention facilities. They said, well, you take the third floor. And we moved the kids into the third floor, and we ran a detention program at that particular facility. And we did that all around us.
So the roots for the current structure were set in deinstitutionalization.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if you look at that, and that's not just with DYS, if you want to look at the major agencies, mental health, VinFin, you know, when they start closing the institutions, that's where they came from. Till Inc. and so many other great programs for mentally retarded started at that time. And for us, even though we were, compared to those agencies, DYS, we were small. We were the first in the nation that did it. And I really believe it became the catalyst for others to do it. Don't, you know, they were smart enough to say, wait a minute, we're not going to do it like that. But it did really say, because what it really came down to is you said, those kids aren't getting good treatment in these programs. There are other people out there that can do that. When we went through the population of the kids at that time, we actually had kids with cerebral palsy. As I say, we had kids who were mentally retarded. We had kids who were absolutely psychotic. And you say, well, why am I taking care of them? And the real reason was this is the place the courts could order kids to go. You couldn't order them to go to other places. And so it was DYS that was getting banged around for, you know, you're not giving proper treatment to these kids. But of course they never gave, there were no psychiatrists in DYS at the time. There were very few certified teachers at the time.
So tell me, you come into this environment. What are your priorities? What are your top priorities? What are your challenges?
Well, as I said, the department started in '69, and by '73, I won't say the governor's office so much, but the legislators and an awful lot of other folks in the state, and the judges and all, they were through with Jerry Miller. He really, because he was he was just straight out there. And he used to tell me that. He said, you know, Joe, I'm not going to give you a roadmap. I go by compass. And he said, my idea is, you know, if you want to get someplace, jump on the horse, ride it as fast as you can, and at a certain point, the horse gets tired, get out. And so he came to me in January, and he said, yeah, I've accepted a job in Illinois. And this was really something that, as much as there were certain people who were very supportive, even the legislators who were supportive, and I think the governor who was quite supportive of him, they were happy to see him go. Because the legislators, other legislators were saying, that's it, we're not going to vote any more money for the department. There was such resistance. So Jerry goes very quickly, and I went in, like in January 15th, I think it was, and I go into the governor's office. You know, he wasn't there, but Al Kramer, who later became a judge, and a few others were there. And they said, what's all these problems we're hearing about the Department of Youth Services? I mean, you know, it was saying that the kids are out there, these group homes are not being supervised enough, and you've got all of the staff who are still sitting in the institutions with no kids. And you've got the institutions themselves with nobody in them, but it's costing an awful lot of money. So I did say, well, you know, the problems didn't start today. You know, this is my first day, you know, just here, you know. But what are you going to do about it? Well, what we had to do was really establish the community-based programs, because if you take an agency like the Department of Child and Family Services, they have always just purchased service. They never ran an institution. Here we have an agency that for